Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. We are meeting today to receive testimony on the way forward with fusion centers, challenges and strategies for change. More than 6 years after 9/11, our nation has seen a revolution in information sharing, perhaps most dramatically at the state and local levels with the creation of some 42 intelligence fusion centers. A year ago this month, Charlie Allen, the department's chief intelligence officer, noted that, quote, fusion centers are recognized by the Director of National Intelligence as a center of gravity, key to the effective exchange and assessment of information between federal government and state and local partners. These centers, staffed by police and sheriff's officers, public health authorities, private sector representatives, and others, are an effective ground-up response to the need for more and better information about terrorist threats so communities can prepare and prevent. Rather than waiting for the federal government to arrive and save the day after 9/11, I applaud, and I know all members of this subcommittee applaud, the initiative of state and locals to figure out what data they need and how to get it to protect their neighborhoods and their communities. I think everyone recognizes that fusion centers hold tremendous promise, and the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI are among those who share the view that they hold tremendous promise. Both of these entities have begun stationing hundreds of their employees on site to assist in fusion center efforts. The members of this subcommittee, as I mentioned, have been strong supporters as well. Together, we have visited 4 fusion centers in Los Angeles, Seattle, Denver, and Baltimore, and we plan to see more. We've also made sure that the recently enacted 9/11 Recommendations Act, H.R. 1, includes tools that DHS needs to help fusion centers with their information sharing missions, both locally and nationally. Our purpose in drafting the legislation this way was a simple one: to encourage the Department of Homeland Security to partner, I want to emphasize that word, partner, more effectively with fusion centers and the FBI and other entities located there. Not to dictate to them about who should be doing what, but to partner with them to determine what should be going on. While fusion centers have great potential, we acknowledge that they are not without challenges, and that's why we're here today. I commend CRS and GAO for the helpful research they've done on fusion centers, research that can help us structure useful federal roles going forward. CRS and GAO have both raised issues about the fusion center future that need clear answers. Number one, the absence of a national strategy. Many fusion centers are essentially co-location centers. They lack skills and resources to develop or disseminate accurate, actionable, and timely information in order for communities that they represent to be protected. They lack sustainable resources. They lack a common baseline, one that consistently focuses people on figuring out what facts they need to protect against particular threats. After reading the reports, I'm baffled why DHS and the FBI still haven't consolidated their multiple information sharing systems, so fusion center staff doesn't need to log on to 3, 4, or 5 different networks to determine what threats they're waking up to each morning. The department promised us earlier this year that it would be looking into ways to make HISN, HSIN, and RISNet work together better. I hope that the department representative on our second panel will have a progress report. The reports also raise other important questions about privacy and civil liberties training, something we've explored in other hearings, about the disturbing fact that DHS and the FBI don't recognize each other's security clearances at fusion centers. This is obviously absurd. All of us hope for success, and this hearing should move us forward. But before turning to our witnesses, let me use this podium to deliver 2 other messages to the Department of Homeland Security. In addition to the fusion center issue, the 9/11 Act, H.R. 1, included a framework for the Interagency Threat Assessment and Coordination Group, the ITAG, at the National Counterterrorism Center. It's a lot of acronyms, but the National Counterterrorism Center is our national fusion center. The ITAG is a common sense idea that should help us incorporate state and local people in the fashioning of intelligence fusion products, so that when they reach state and local entities, including fusion centers, they are useful. We have had a long and sad fight about this effort to include state and local people in the ITAG. Mr. Reichert and I and the chairman and ranking member yesterday sent yet another letter to the Department of Homeland Security, but I was informed late last evening by the deputy at DHS, Michael Jackson, that finally a memorandum of agreement on this subject was signed either last night or early this morning. We look forward to reviewing it, and we look forward to a visit to the NCTC with Mr. Jackson to make certain that state and local people are properly in place and that at long last they are contributing what is necessary to fashioning our national fusion center products. The other issue I just want to mention is that I understand from reading the press that the department is going to proceed next Monday in standing up its new office to task military intelligence satellites to do certain jobs focused on the homeland. This was the subject of a hearing a few weeks ago. This committee on a bipartisan basis has requested the legal underpinnings of this document. Some of us sent a letter urging a moratorium on the operation of this function until we get those documents. My understanding is we don't have those documents, and I think the department's action is ill-advised. Let me just welcome our witnesses and now yield to the ranking member for his opening statement before we start the hearing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. Our hearing today focuses on fusion centers and is made possible by the long-standing efforts of this subcommittee to focus on the critical information sharing efforts taking place at fusion centers. And I think when most people think about fusion centers, they think about the fusion of the collection of intel and the fusion of the intel, the analysis of the intelligence gathered. But you know, there's more to fusion centers, and that it's a fusion of people, and it's a fusion of organizations, and the information coming together, the intelligence coming together, is really one of the easier aspects of this concept to accomplish. One of the harder things is getting the organizations to recognize each other as equals in this effort. And the thing that makes it work is really, in my opinion, is the fusion of the personalities. And the more that you can include the personalities from the different organizations, the more that you'll see this really does become a fusion center that's functioning in the way that we would all like to see this concept finally take place. So we know it's going to be a long process. We know there's going to be some hiccups in the process, but I think, at least from my experience, I've gone totally off of my speaking points here. I'm speaking straight from my heart here. I have 33 years of experience in law enforcement, local law enforcement, starting in a patrol car, hostage negotiator, SWAT commander, precinct commander, homicide investigator, and finally as the sheriff in Seattle. And in every one of those positions throughout my 33-year career, I've had the opportunity to work and interact with the federal agencies. So not only at a base street level, working with the agents on the street from every federal agency that you could imagine, but also from the level of the sheriff's office, one of the largest sheriff's offices in the nation, and working with the SACs of those organizations and trying to come up with a way that we could all work together to make this community safer. So, you know, when you do that, you make friends. And when you make friends, you make progress. And that's really when the hard work gets done. And as a part of working together and building those relationships, wanting to share information and analyze information, we also want to be very cognizant of our civil liberties, and the chairwoman mentioned that as one of our concerns also. We appreciate the studies that you've done and recognize that there's going to be some criticism shared with us today, and we think that's important for us to hear. but we also want to recognize the progress that's been made. And again, I know from my day on the street how it was then and how it is today, and there's tremendous progress that's been made. So that progress is made when the criticism is received in a way that's constructive and is presented in a constructive way. So we hope that today that constructive criticism is shared with us, and it's taken in a way that is constructive, so that we can all move forward and make sure that our communities are safe and this country is safe, and that we continue to be a free nation with all of our civil liberties protected. That's the job of all of us in this room. And Madam Chair, I yield and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts.
I thank the ranking member for his comments and agree with all of them. I think your experience brings great value to this subcommittee. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. And now it is time to welcome our first panel. Our first witness, Todd Massey, is currently a specialist in domestic intelligence and counterterrorism with the CRS, the Congressional Research Service. In this position, he provides nonpartisan counterterrorist and domestic intelligence analysis to members of Congress and our staffs. Prior to joining CRS, he spent a decade with the FBI in the counterintelligence and counterterrorism fields. He served in as both an intelligence research specialist and subsequently a strategic intelligence advisor. He's worked closely with senior executives of the FBI on strategic planning for intelligence and counterintelligence in identifying and assessing the foreign intelligence and terrorist threats to the U.S. Our second witness, John Rowlands, is a CRS employee who serves as a specialist in terrorism and international crime. Prior to joining CRS, he was the Chief of Staff of the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence. Mr. Rowlands' career includes a variety of analytic, legal, and management positions in the Army, FBI, CIA, DIA, U.S. Marine Corps, Delta Force, and the United Nations. This man sadly cannot hold a job. He is a licensed attorney and graduate of the Senior Executive Fellowship Program at Harvard University. Our third witness, Eileen Lawrence, currently serves as a Director for Homeland Security and Justice Issues at the GAO, where she manages congressional requests to assess various Homeland Security issues. These include assessing the state of Homeland Security information sharing since 9/11 and the protection of the nation's most critical infrastructure. And by the way, I think you've all heard me in past hearings commend the Department for a lot of progress on identifying what that infrastructure ought to be. Ms. Lawrence has a master's in public administration and extensive experience at GAO. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record, and I now ask each of you to summarize for 5 minutes or less, beginning with Mr. Massey.
Chairwoman Harmon, Ranking Member Reichert, and members of the committee, my name is Todd Massey, and I'm a specialist in domestic intelligence and counterterrorism with the Congressional Research Service. I'm joined today by my colleague and co-author John Rowlands, who is a specialist in intelligence and international crime. Per your instructions, we'll keep our opening remarks brief to allow ample time for questions and answers. You've asked us to share the findings of our analysis with respect to state fusion centers. Our research and analysis led to the publication of the CRS report, Fusion Centers, Issues and Options for Congress. A summary of this report has been submitted for the record. I will speak to the Fusion Center value proposition, risks to the Fusion Center concept, and other descriptive and analytic findings. Mr. Rowlands will then discuss federalism and the federal role in supporting fusion centers, as well as options for Congress. Before sharing a summary of our subset of findings, I'd like to first make a few brief remarks about our research methodology. In order to reach the greatest amount of fusion centers and gather the most comprehensive set of data, CRS designed and fielded an original survey. We conducted in-depth interviews with 36 fusion center representatives. We also consulted with interested federal stakeholders, including the Department of Homeland Security, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Program Manager for the Information Sharing Environment. We attended the first annual National Fusion Center Conference and held our own Fusion Center seminar, at which Fusion Center representatives from Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia were in attendance. We also visited a number of fusion centers, including the Maryland Coordination and Analysis Center in Baltimore. The creation of post-9/11 fusion centers does not represent a totally new concept, but suggests an extension of pre-9/11 state and local law enforcement intelligence entities. Most state police agencies have run intelligence or analytic units for decades. Many of the fusion centers examined for this report were the outgrowths of those units, prompting some to refer to fusion centers as, quote, state police intelligence units on steroids, end quote. However, the function of sharing classified weapons of mass destruction, terrorism information, and homeland security information is new. The fusion center value proposition is relatively straightforward. By integrating various streams of information and intelligence, including that from the federal government, state, local, and tribal governments, as well as the private sector, a more accurate picture of risks to people, economic infrastructure, and communities can be developed and translated into protective action. While we believe the fusion center value proposition has substantial merit and potential, developing the appropriate skill sets, resources, and intelligence philosophy to implement that value proposition is essential. We identified at least 4 risks for the potential future development of fusion centers. The first is intelligence philosophy. The second, civil liberty and privacy concerns. Third, time concerns. And fourth, sustainment funding. Fusion center roles and responsibilities. Many of the first wave fusion centers, those created after 9/11, were solely focused on counterterrorism. Today, less than 15% of the fusion centers describe their mission as solely counterterrorism. Budgets. Annual budgets for the fusion centers range from the tens of thousands to several $1,000,000, with one center at over $15 million. Federal funding ranged from 0 to 100% of fusion center budgets, with the average and median percentage of federal funding at approximately 31% and 21% respectively. Thus, it appears on the whole, fusion centers are predominantly state and local funded. Mr. Rollins will now speak to federalism, the federal role in supporting the fusion centers, and options for Congress.
Good morning.
The chair recognizes Mr. Rollins, and I gather you're sharing your time for testifying. Is that correct?
That's correct. I will be brief. I would like to touch briefly on 2 issues, federalism and options for Congress. Federal role in supporting fusion centers. Part of the challenge from the federal perspective has been how to guide and support, in your words, Chairwoman, be a partner, but not dictate how these state-established fusion centers manage their internal priorities. Federal activities that may address these concerns include providing strategy-based guidance to be adopted by state fusion centers, providing technical assistance and training, providing financial resources to support fusion center startup and sustainability costs, and providing personnel resources. Currently, DHS Office of Intelligence has 17 personnel assigned to state fusion centers. The FBI has over 250 personnel assigned to state fusion centers. Options for Congress. It should be noted, every fusion center challenge does not necessarily have a federal solution. However, should Congress seek to act, our research suggests 2 tiers of options for congressional consideration. Tier 1, national strategy and sustainable resources. At present, a national fusion center strategy does not exist. One option for Congress is to recommend that the executive branch draft an interagency national fusion center strategy. Naturally, we recommend that state and regional fusion center representatives be a part of developing this strategy. Second, address the sustainment funding question. The question of sustainment funding was foremost in the mind of state fusion center leaders. Should federal funding to fusion centers be continued? If so, to what end? And what conditions should Congress place on the federal funds that are provided to fusion centers? The second tiered option focuses on creating a true and trusted partnership. Further development of the relationship between federal law enforcement and intelligence community organizations with state fusion centers may prove helpful. The following activities may facilitate relationship building efforts: agreeing upon federal and state mission objectives, enhancing training and outreach efforts, and enhancing information access and management. This concludes our opening remarks. Thank you for convening this important hearing. We look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Rollins. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lawrence. And is it Lawrence? Lawrence?
It's Lawrence.
You're recognized for a 5-minute summary of your prepared testimony.
Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here today to summarize the preliminary results of our reviews of state and local information fusion centers. We expect to issue a final report next month. Madam Chair, as you recognize, after 9/11, states and major urban areas realized they needed to fill a void. They needed their own capability to collect, analyze, and share terrorism information since the federal government could not meet their unique needs. They also realized they could be important eyes and ears to provide the government information, especially on homegrown terrorism. So states and localities created fusion centers with personnel from federal, state, and local law enforcement and homeland security organizations, and in some cases, the National Guard, emergency responders, or the private sector. The federal government, in turn, realized centers could be a critical node in the information sharing environment that the Congress called for, and so decided to build a national network of centers, which DHS and DOJ are to support with grants, technology, training, and other help. This spring, we interviewed directors in 50 states, D.C., and 8 urban areas, and learned that centers vary tremendously, that federal help to date will address but not fully resolve their primary challenges, and that they are concerned about the federal long-term commitment to sustaining centers. More specifically, we learned that centers in 35 states, D.C., and 7 localities consider themselves operational, but this ranged tremendously, from having 5 to 80 personnel, and from a few to 20 participating agencies. Most centers are relatively new. 34 were open since 2004. 20 of them focused on terrorism as well as traditional crime, and 18 others said they also focused on other hazards. They did so because they recognized that crime can be a precursor to terrorism. For example, drug money can fund terrorist acts, and that having more members could mean more resources. Law enforcement organizations, as you recognize, lead most centers, and 12 are co-located with the FBI. Most centers can take tips from the public that they can share with federal agencies and provide products such as alerts, bulletins, and in-depth reports. Centers most frequently identified 6 major challenges that federal support to date is helping to address but may not fully resolve. The first is fundamentally about information. Some 30 centers raised this issue, from having too many systems to getting too much information, often redundant, thereby clogging their operations. DHS and DOJ each provide centers access to unclassified and some classified systems. A federal working group is reviewing ways to streamline this access, and as you acknowledged, an Interagency Threat Assessment Center, made permanent in the 9/11 Commission Act, is to provide consolidated terrorism information to states and localities. But the center is still forming, and oversight could help ensure its progress. Second, security clearances. 32 centers said it takes too long to get clearances from DHS and DOJ, and 19 said the agencies don't always honor each other's clearances, known as reciprocity, even though law and executive order mandate it. The agencies have each provided states and localities about 500 clearances and have had goals to issue them faster, but they were not aware of nor addressing the issue about reciprocity. Third, guidance. Centers appreciated the guidelines DOJ and DHS jointly issued to date and that were codified in the 9/11 Act, and the technical support agencies provide. But some centers need more specific operating guidance or how-to steps, such as how to share information while protecting civil liberties. The National Fusion Center Coordination Group has drafted a set of baseline capabilities for centers that provide them some additional guidance, but not yet the details they need. Fourth, training. Centers want help determining which of the many courses they should use, especially for advanced training, and in funding them, as well as common training standards and a curricula for analysts. The baseline capabilities draft addresses training, but not yet standards and defined courses. Fifth, 43 centers identified personnel issues. 37 had challenges getting detailees from their member agencies, and 20 said finding, attracting, and paying analysts and retaining them because of competition for their skills was difficult. The FBI has personnel in 3/4 of the centers to date, and DHS has personnel in 17, with plans to staff 18 more by the end of 2008. This helps, but centers are still concerned about meeting staffing needs, especially in the long run. Finally, 54 of the 58 centers pointed to funding challenges. 28 cited competition for limited state and local funds, and 35 cited complex, restricted, uncertain, and declining federal grants as issues. DHS has provided about $131 million in grants through 2006 that states and localities use for fusion-related activities, made support for centers a top priority for law enforcement grants, and expanded allowable costs and timeframes for spending the money. But centers are worried about sustaining operations over the long term. Since the federal government expects to depend on centers, while it cannot commit future resources, we are recommending that it determine and articulate whether it expects to have a long-term role in sustaining centers critical counterterrorism partners. Madam Chair, that concludes my remarks, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
I thank the witnesses for their testimony and remind each member that in the order of arrival, you will each have 5 minutes to question the panel. Now I'll recognize myself for some questions. Mr. Rollins, you and Mr. Massey briefed some of us yesterday on your findings, and you made an analogy to Little League. I was struck by this as a mother of 2 daughters who played lacrosse and 2 sons who were in Little League and who were quite clueless wandering around the field. And as a parent, I was just sitting in the stands praying they wouldn't be beaned by a ball. Could you explain this analogy to on the record? I think it would be helpful as we ask you questions about fusion centers.
Of course, as the father of 3 young daughters, this hits home to me at present. The analogy is a newly formed Little League baseball team, where the players on the field, some are state and local, some come from the FBI, very few are from DHS, some from the military, specifically the National Guard. So you've got a composition of different players with different skill sets and different objectives on the field. Some have equipment, some have databases, some have communications devices, some have analytic tools, most do not. But generally, nobody knows the rules of the game. What's the strategy? Is the strategy to score the most points? Is the strategy in the Fusion Center? Yes, the strategy is to stop terrorism. But how do we get there from here? There's a lack of understanding of what each partner's skills and abilities, of what equipment is needed, and the rules to carry out the game.
I appreciate that, and it's helpful to me as I think about this. I think that the work that all of you have done is helpful to us as we think about this. All of us have said this is a good concept, but clearly we need to do some work on both a strategy and on sustainable resources. And all of you have given us some guidance. And you also, Ms. Lawrence, have pointed up the security clearance issue, which is a big problem. And I hope that our witnesses on the next panel will address this and will address the differences between them. They are the DHS witness and the FBI witness in terms of clearances. Surely we don't want to be throwing up any more obstacles to state and locals in their effort to find out what plots are going on in their neighborhoods. But let me ask you this. As we move forward with a strategy and perhaps some strings attached to federal money so that we make clear the strategy is being followed, don't we risk setting up a new bureaucracy and insisting on cookie-cutter fusion centers, which may not accurately reflect the needs of very diverse communities?
I'll respond to that. I believe you're right there. There is a risk of doing exactly that. And one of the elements that we heard in each of our conversations with fusion centers is that these are state and locally formed entities. And you don't want to lose that flavor by coming in, for instance, and federalizing it, or by providing a sustainable amount of funding, over-conditioning that on guidelines that are not responsive to their state and local demands. So there is a balance, I think, to be played here. There are national goals, counterterrorism goals, homeland security goals, but there are also state and local goals. And so the bringing together of those two, the integration of those goals, I think is incredibly important. And as a strategy is developed, that's one of the reasons why John and I recommended, as a strategy is being developed for what those roles and responsibilities are, that the state and local members, the Fusion Center directors, are brought into at the earliest stages of drafting such a national strategy so they can have input and buy into that strategy as we move forward.
Let me just comment that that's been our view about this ITAG that I mentioned in my opening remarks, that if you bring in the state and locals to design a strategy of information sharing, it's a similar topic, you have a better chance that it will be effective. Any other responses to my question?
Yes, Madam Chair, I'd just point out that DHS has acknowledged that they can't take a cookie-cutter approach to centers, and in fact, they do pretty intensive assessments at individual centers, looking to see what that particular center needs based on its geographic location, the risks posed to that community, and it is trying to make risk-based funding decisions about where it's putting dollars and personnel. So I think DHS is on that track.
Well, I hope so. As I mentioned, numbers of us have been to numbers of these fusion centers. They're very different. I think that's a good thing. But some of them are extremely modest in borrowed space with detailees and basically no budgets and no capability to fuse intelligence. They're more center of co-location, as some of you have said, for people rather than a fusion center. So I'm concerned that we don't have capability yet in many parts of the country that could be useful, and I think there is a role to play here, not to build a bureaucracy, but to build capability. And now let me yield 5 minutes for questions to the ranking member, Sheriff Reichert, who brings very special skills to this issue.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. We all here in this committee have a background of experience that brings different perspective to this issue. But I agree with the chair that I get a little nervous when you talk about federal standards and federal involvement in local law enforcement. It is because I've had that experience before, but I think it is a good idea to have a national strategy and allow the fusion centers to develop, because I think the best ideas come from the bottom up. People who are doing the job know how to get it done, and we need to let that process continue to be free and open, and at the same time give direction. I think that's the real challenge that we're facing. First of all, which fusion centers were visited in the studies that were conducted? Can you give me?
Yes, we personally visited the centers in California, Arizona, Georgia, Virginia, Maryland, New York, and New Jersey, but we interviewed all 50 states.
Good, okay. We've been to several too, as the chair has said, and we have noticed differences between Seattle and LA and Denver and other places. So did you find any one of those that was really doing it right, in your opinion? Was there one in particular that you might say, gee, this is kind of the shining
Be careful how you answer here.
I'm sure it's Seattle.
Well, we sort of have, Gio, we're not allowed to have these, but we sort of had a gut reaction after looking at all 50 states. We think there's probably about a handful that are really mature and well-staffed, and some of those included, I mean, New York City is kind of the gold standard.
Right.
California, Arizona as well, and Arizona is really helping to address border operations. So they're up and functioning, providing operational support. And the other extreme, there are some, as you mentioned, some centers that have at this point 3 personnel and are just trying to get their act together.
I mean, they would be resources I would think that you would draw from in order to help establish a better foundation for some of those that are still. I know Seattle it really has a good program, but they have a ways to go when I compare it to Los Angeles and of course New York. But there is a resource I would suggest, and I'm sure you've already considered that would be very useful in helping others across the nation with that local input and the federal input. Now, this all crimes approach is one that seems to be a consistent theme that we've heard. What's your opinion on how that approach, and as we look at the evolution of fusion centers, first beginning to, at the local level, and now after September 11th, taking on this broader view, a broader mission of protecting our borders, and so now all these have come together in an all crimes approach. What's your opinion of that approach in keeping our borders safe and at the same time addressing local crime?
That's a very good question. I think one of the things, there are a number of reasons for that. Because a lot of these centers are largely staffed with state and local detailees, these centers, when they initially started off, were focusing on terrorism, and there was not a lot of quote-unquote terrorism work happening at these centers. And so there was a reluctance on the part of, I think, some state and local law enforcement agencies that, as you know very well, are pressed for resources to continue to send those valuable resources to a fusion center that was working solely on counterterrorism issues. And so that's one reason. I think a second reason has been mentioned earlier is looking at criminal activity as a precursor to terrorism. Whether or not there is money laundering activities that are going on that are supporting terrorism. As you know, as a sheriff and an investigator, you look at a particular type of criminal activity, you're not certain if there is any nexus to terrorism or not until you investigate and start to look at that. So I think those are two of the reasons that we've seen sort of a movement from a solely counterterrorism-based approach to an all-crimes, all-hazard-based approach.
Anyone else?
I would just offer, I think this connects to your earlier question, centers that are doing this right, pardon me, there are natural competing interests presently at the state fusion centers and the federal government. Because this transformation over time has reverted back to a criminal or all hazards view of state and local issues rather than a national counterterrorism view, we've got competing interests of what are our priorities, local gangs or radicalized gangs that are coming out of prison. So there's this natural tension built into the issue.
Right. The answers I expected. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the ranking member. Our most recent field hearing was in Denver, Colorado, and our host was Mr. Perlmutter. At that hearing, we explored both steps that are being taken to secure Denver for the National Convention, the Democratic National Convention that will be there next year, which requires fusing law enforcement and other functions, both local, state, and federal. But we visited the Fusion Center, which was a very impressive thing to see. And I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And I agree with the two that have spoken before. What we've seen on our trips is really vast differences between, say, Los Angeles, which had a very sophisticated operation just from, a layman's look at the place, with a whole variety of services available to the metro area for Los Angeles, to Denver, where, sort of in the nascent state of 5 or 6 people working, as best they could with other local agencies and the feds. Just in terms of the structure of fusion centers today, who's in charge of fusion centers?
I think that's a very valid question, and that would probably be point one of addressing a national strategy. You look at as my colleague John just mentioned, there are different interests. There are the federal interests in counterterrorism. There are the state and local interests that also are in counterterrorism, but also in preventing organized crime and sophisticated criminal activities in their state. So the question becomes, what are the actual authorities for fusion centers? And one of the things that we found when we talked to the fusion centers we did is that some of them don't have any legal authorities. Some of them operate under an executive order. Some of them that are affiliated with the state police agency operate under state police authorities. When you look at the federal regulations and the extent to which they guide fusion center activities, it's pretty much 28 CFR, which looks at the operation of criminal intelligence systems. And I think most of the fusion centers are very well trained on 28 CFR in what types of information they can actually collect, under what circumstances they can collect, how long they can handle that information, retain it, and analysis they can do with it, and who they can share it with. So, but the question of who is in charge is very much an open one.
I would just add at the federal level, and probably at the state and local level, sir, I think most would look at the Department of Homeland Security as being in charge, or the executive agent of national fusion center efforts. However, with that said, as we heard earlier, DHS has only 17 personnel assigned to these centers, to grow in the future, to be certain, has a undetermined amount of money devoted to these centers, contrasted to the FBI having 250 personnel in these centers, the FBI sponsoring many of the security clearances for personnel in the centers, the FBI paying for the leasing of facilities for many of these centers. So once again, I think there's the programmatic answer, but then the on-the-ground question of who is at the federal level responsible for supporting fusion centers.
And I think that's important. And I like to, sometimes maybe I'm too simplistic, but there's got to be a place where the buck stops on these things. And I think in Los Angeles, we saw virtually every there were a lot of federal agencies operating out of that office. The FBI, intelligence community was there, DHS was there, Health and Human Services was there. They had the whole shebang. And then the sheriff's office and various police departments and the medical services for the Los Angeles area. And in that instance, it seemed like the FBI was sort of, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, Madam Chair, but it seemed like they were sort of, they and the sheriff seemed to be, for Los Angeles County, seemed to be the top guns in that particular office. But at some level, I think we've got to have somebody who says, we want these things to work. We understand they're each going to have their different personality because they serve different purposes. Denver's going to have different issues than Los Angeles or New York City. In respect of this, and I just asked all of the panel members, do you, after having reviewed this and studied this, do you think it's appropriate just for these centers to have the analytic approach, and that's what they should be, just provide analysis for local agencies or whatever? Should there be an operational kind of all crimes, all hazards approach to this as well?
I think it really depends. In order to have sort of a federal dictate to fusion centers to say you will all be analytic units, so you will all be all crimes or all hazards, that may be an instance in which the existing fusion centers would view that as the federal government telling them what they need to do on a day-to-day basis. I think when you look at a lot of the centers, I think a lot of them were analytic-based. That is, they were hiring intelligence analysts to look at the base of criminal intelligence and federal intelligence flowing in, and then that went into supporting state and local investigations and operations. Others that were more closely tied to the state and police or state intelligence units did have an operational. So it depends on a lot of issues, including the resources that they have at the state level, whether or not you would want to be an operation and analytical, and do you have the skill sets, the appropriate personnel skill sets to do both or either or.
Thank you. My time has expired, so thank you.
If anyone else wanted to answer that question briefly, please proceed.
I was just going to briefly add, from the federal perspective, I don't think it's useful to be prescriptive on how the state centers are organized, whether they're analytic, operational, all hazards, simply crime. I think from the federal perspective, we are more concerned about ensuring counterterrorism-related information makes its way up to the federal chain and down and to each fusion center. So how a state wishes to internally organize, that I think that's fine. We just need to ensure that we're the benefactors of counterterrorism-related information. One shortcoming that's related to this is all counterterrorism-related information, even in the most mature centers, isn't making its way into the fusion center. Most often, it's making its way to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which at other times is shared with the federal government, DHS, maybe not shared with the fusion center.
I just had 3 quick points. We think doing the fusions part is hard enough, and that they should focus on that and get that right. I think adding operations onto that is an extremely huge challenge. Just a reminder that Congress authorized the Department of Homeland Security to be the lead agency for sharing with state and local. So you've already clarified DHS has that role. And I also wanted to point out that we not forget about Mr. McNamara and his Office of Information, the Program Manager for the Information Sharing Environment. That office is responsible for defining the whole kit and caboodle, for defining sharing with across federal agencies as well as state and local. They already have working groups and an infrastructure in place with state and local representatives to be making these decisions about how are we going to do this. And so I think we should also consider them a key player in trying to define a national strategy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. Chair now recognizes Mr. Carney of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is a nice segue into the discussion. I'm very curious as to the relationship that the federal intelligence community has with fusion centers. I mean, how well is that shared? Has consistent procedures by the federal intelligence community been developed? Have they been developed to share? You know, do we have predictable avenues of sharing up and down, you know, from the states upward and from the federal government downward? We really haven't addressed that clearly yet.
Well, what we found in our study is it's primarily through the FBI and through DHS. A number of centers are co-located with the FBI, and so they get national intelligence information through the federal personnel there, the FBI personnel, through their systems, and DHS is bringing that through his and some of their systems as well. We did hear complaints from some of the centers that they don't get direct access to these systems and to this information. It has to go through and be vetted through federal agencies. Part of that is because they don't have the security structure yet that they need in their facilities. And it's our understanding in talking with the National Counterterrorism Center that they think they're statutorily almost forbidden to be able to share directly with state and locals, and that, you know, they have to go through primarily DHS to do that.
Well, that's raw or finished intelligence at the national level, certainly. Mr. Massey, Mr. Rollins, please feel free.
Yeah, one of the issues we saw in terms of the information flow was sort of a push versus pull, and that is when you were talking to some of the fusion centers there, one of their complaints was that they weren't getting the right information. And part of that was that they didn't feel like they had enough requisite knowledge to ask the right questions or to have requests for information fulfilled in a timely fashion. And so they had to sort of pull the information versus having the federal community, the federal intelligence community through the NCTC operating through FBI and DHS to push out that information. And I think there are a number of credible reasons and compelling reasons for that. Part of it is that the lack of cultural understanding between the two communities. And any initiatives that bring together those two communities, such as having state and locals at the ITAG, integrating perhaps state and local fusion center analysts into the NCTC itself, Directorate of Intelligence, they begin to learn about one another's needs, and then can therefore be more responsive to them.
I would just offer that there's appears to be a lack of understanding of information sharing thresholds, if you will. What type of information needs to be shared with whom, when, and then once that conversation takes place, what are the technology devices, the communication devices that would facilitate sharing? So do we at the federal level want everything shared from state and locals, whether there's a terrorism nexus or not, or is there a defined threshold to share? And same with the federal. What are the requirements from the federal government going down to the state and local fusion centers that if you identify this type of activity, we would like information on it?
Have we gained any knowledge, any insight from the exercises like Top Off on how this is supposed to work and flow?
The current Top Off is addressing sharing with information sharing with state and local fusion. But as you know, it's still in the process. Previous Top Offs, just because of the nature of the maturation of state and local fusions, did not look at that.
Let's pretend for a moment that we have all the resources we need to defend the country. What, in the best of all worlds, would a fusion center look like? What would be? Let me put it this way: we don't have all, but we have enough to do at least the minimum requirement for a fusion center. What would that look like? What would you need in a fusion center to be effective? Mr. Massey?
I think one of the most important things, fusion centers are people. I mean, this is what we're trying to do here. As Mr. Reichert had mentioned, is you're not only fusing people to develop the relationships, but you're also fusing information. So you have to have, in our belief, a core set of intelligence professionals that understand the intelligence cycle. The intelligence cycle, it's Intel 101. Even in the federal intelligence community, everyone talks about it as if it's implemented on a day-to-day basis, and it's not. Right. It needs to become far more formal, and people and individuals, including from state governors and fusion center leaders and everyone in between, Homeland Security advisors, need to understand intelligence, the discipline itself in the intelligence cycle, and how to implement that cycle so they can serve both the state governors and their Homeland Security needs, as well as the federal intelligence community. If I had to put my finger on one thing, it would be personnel and trained personnel.
Right.
I would just add to Chairwoman Harmon's comment earlier is there are too many systems. Right now, there are too many systems to access of varying degrees of level of security that require, depending on whether it's counterterrorism, counterintelligence, critical infrastructure, there needs to be a decision made on what type of systems, few, that state and locals, everybody in the Fusion Center can access to share information is one. To look to the future of where we would like to end up with this entire national, not federal, Fusion Center constellation is we just saw this summer there was a national intelligence estimate on threats to the homeland. Well, once again, that's the national, that's the federal government's interpretation. In the future, it would be nice to see a truly national, including state and local Fusion Center input into threats to the homeland.
Huh, I guess I was under the impression that that had already occurred.
No, sir.
That's sort of troubling. Madam Chairman, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Carney. Yesterday at our briefing, one of the other things some of the witnesses said was that when they asked Fusion Center personnel about what threats do you face, some of those answers were less than overwhelming. So there is a lot of work to do. The chair now yields 5 minutes to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Dix.
I think this has been a very good work on your part. I want to compliment you. I think we may have had impressions of what was happening at these fusion centers even after visiting them, but I think this comprehensive review of the situation, helps clarify in our minds at least what we're getting out of this. And let me just ask this question. What do the locals, as we said, the local governments are creating these centers in most cases, I guess in all cases. What is their expectation? What do they think they're going to be getting out of this that will be beneficial to them? And then what from the federal point of view, I would hope that we'd be getting the information to these people as we've been discussing, but also getting information from them on the counterterrorism issue. Would you like to take that one on?
Well, what we heard is that in some of the more sophisticated localities recognized early on that they couldn't wait for the federal government, that these acts were potentially going to happen in their jurisdiction, in their communities, and they needed to have their act together. They needed to have good information, they needed to have trained analysts, and they needed technology to help them do that, and to be able to figure out their own unique threats to their communities and how they were going to respond to those. In some cases now, though, I think it's almost a follow the leader. Some communities feel now that because other states and localities have them, that everybody needs them. And so I think in some cases, the money was there, and so they're looking to start these centers, and they're going to need help to get up to speed as well as some of those sophisticated centers are. And for them, it gives them access to the national intelligence community and the federal community. It gives them access to people, to systems, to information, and to help about what to do and how to use that information effectively, and money.
Do we have any good examples of a fusion center picking up on some activity that might have led to a terrorist attack?
I have an anecdote that we learned when we were in Los Angeles. It was shortly after the problems with the chlorine gas tanks occurring overseas. And they got some pretty general bulletins down from the federal government. They were surprised that it took 3 or 4 days to get some information down from DHS on that issue. But they had enough capability to be able to already identify within their communities how often do they get those kinds of traffic, could they reroute them, et cetera. So, LA stepped out and took the initiative to figure out within their communities what threat was posed and how they could manage that.
You also said that, and as we discussed this yesterday, that New York has, because they have the resources, the people, the commitment, is the kind of the gold standard here of what one of these offices might look at. Tell us what New York does that impressed you.
New York has a series of activities that I think are the reason that it's called the gold standard in intelligence. And I think you mentioned three of the top reasons why I think they are the gold standard. I think it starts with commitment at the senior-most level in terms of Commissioner Kelly and his commitment to counterterrorism. The personnel that they've brought in are individuals who have served in the federal intelligence community and have extensive background in intelligence. The resources that they have been provided, but there's also very much, and it exudes throughout their operation, and that is the idea of never again, this prevention mission that I think dominates all else. And to ask permission is to seek denial, is their attitude. And I think they have a series of, they understand their environment, they understand it well. They have a series of core collectors who are out aggressively and proactively collecting intelligence. They have a very large team of analysts who can analyze that information. They've deployed individuals overseas to collect information because they don't want any filters between them, between overseas activities, and having that report come directly.
Is that legal?
That's an open question. I know there have been some questions raised about that.
I did pose that question to them when I was up there, and they seem to determine that their state laws gives them a little bit more flexibility to do some of the things that they're doing.
But does the federal law give them that ability? I mean, you can't, how many, you couldn't have rogue intelligence agencies out there gathering information. I mean that could be, in other countries. I mean, that is somewhat concerning to me.
I think what you'd hear, and I won't speak for them, but I think what you'd hear from them is that these aren't quote-unquote intelligence officers in the traditional sense of CIA or DIA. These are law enforcement to law enforcement on the idea of an FBI legal attaché type of operations.
Let me just one thing on this. Is anybody else doing what New York's doing? Is anybody doing any part of what New York's doing out there at these fusion centers? Or is New York just this unique situation because of the resources and commitment they have?
The latter. They're the latter. Nobody comes close. And it's really, I think, for reasonable reasons, because of what has happened in New York City for the past 2 decades, it's unfair to view the other fusion centers with regard to NYPD intelligence activities.
Well, it strikes me that maybe we ought to be doing the same thing in the District of Columbia and in Los Angeles and in some of these other major urban areas in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dix. While you were asking your questions, I was just talking to staff about the need for a hearing on best practices and to have the NYPD in here, not only the commissioner, but also the deputy commissioners for intelligence and for counterterrorism, people that I personally know well and whom we saw recently, in fact, this week in New York, when 8 of us were up there touring some sites, very concerned about the threat of radiological weapons in New York and in other cities. So I think we can ask a lot of these questions then, and we can hopefully see whether, if this model is as attractive as many think, it can be replicated in other cities under major threat, one of which is the one we're in right now. I want to thank this panel for excellent testimony, very useful reports. We will pay attention to your ideas and look forward to the second panel, which is representatives from DHS and FBI responding to some of your ideas. I think that the order of witnesses this day is very constructive, and in the future, too, we will put panels first of people who are making constructive suggestions to federal officials and then have them respond to the constructive suggestions. So please stick around as we have our second panel. This panel is excused. Yeah, I do. Okay. They're all so young, like my children. scary. Oh, I thought they were different. We're looking for Mr. Mines. Here you are. It's my pleasure to welcome our second panel. Our first witness, Jack Tamarchio, was appointed by President Bush as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at DHS in late December 2005. Mr. Tamarchio's core responsibilities include working with state and local governments, the private sector, and other members of the federal intelligence community to ensure that critical intelligence is more effectively and efficiently shared. Prior to joining the department, he was a partner in a national law firm. Our second witness, Michael Mines, serves as the Deputy Assistant Director in the FBI's Directorate of Intelligence. Mr. Mines began his FBI career in 1980 when he was assigned as a media specialist in the Office of Public Affairs at FBI. He became an FBI special agent in 1983. In 2005, he was appointed special agent in charge of the criminal division of the Washington field office, where he was responsible for all criminal and cybercrime issues in this city and in Northern Virginia. In 2006, he was named Deputy Assistant Director at FBI headquarters. Our third witness, Norman Beasley, will provide our state and local perspective. Very important. He currently serves as the Counterterrorism Coordinator for the Maricopa County, Arizona Sheriff's Office, where he provides support to the office in the areas of counterterrorism, special events, demonstration management, intelligence, facial recognition, and homeland security-related issues. I think you can go head-to-head with Sheriff Reichert here. He was responsible for the development, implementation, and operation of the Arizona Counterterrorism Information Center, a multi-agency operation involving over 240 state, local, and federal officers from 41 agencies. The center has become a national model for intelligence fusion centers, and we just heard that from the last folks. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I'd now ask each of you to summarize your statement in 5 minutes, and we will start with Mr. Tamarchio. I think your mic is not on.
Let's try that. I have a brief opening statement. Madam Chairwoman, I am pleased to be here today to present to you and the members of this committee the status of the Department of Homeland Security's State and Local Fusion Center program, which is now 15 months in existence. Developed to address our specific statutory requirements created under the Homeland Security Act of 2002, this program was designed to share national intelligence and threat information with our state, local, tribal, and private sector partners, all of whom are necessary allies in our nation's efforts to protect the homeland. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis was tasked by Secretary Chertoff as the executive agent within the department for the management of the Fusion Center program on June 6, 2006. And the department's Chief Intelligence Officer, Assistant Secretary Charles E. Allen, specifically placed the management of the program under me as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis. Over the past 15 months, my staff and I have made this our core effort, and I am pleased to inform you that we continue to meet our goals as we expand the program to more states and municipalities throughout the nation. I am also pleased to testify today with Mr. Mike Mines, the Deputy Assistant Director for Intelligence of the FBI, which has been and continues to be a constant and valuable partner with us in the Fusion Center program. Few programs have received the level of attention in the first year as this program has. You will hear today from the Congressional Research Service, which you already heard from them, and the General Accountability Office, the FBI, and from our state partners about our efforts. Unfortunately, there will be some weaknesses revealed. We recognize that. And we continue to work to improve the program together with our state, local, tribal, and other federal partners. Each level of scrutiny informs us. We have read the CRS report on fusion centers, and we agree with the recommendations in general for improving the operational aspects of these centers. We do, however, take exception with the CRS report finding that the fusion centers are not operating successfully as counterterrorism nodes. We await the final report from GAO, with whom we have worked closely in over a year now to provide an unprecedented level of transparency and cooperation in their attempts to accurately inform you of our progress. We believe in what we do, and we hope this will be apparent in their report. We were advised just last week that our program will undergo a congressionally sponsored Inspector General review by the Department's IG office, whose results should be delivered to the House Homeland Security Committee in the spring of 2008. And finally, we have been scrutinized by the media, who have released dozens of articles over the past years relating to our activity. Mr. Allen and I welcome scrutiny, for as I said earlier, each level of scrutiny informs us of our progress, highlights our strong points, and underlines those areas where more work needs to be done. It has always been our intent that this program stand tall in the light of scrutiny, and we remain proud of the work we are doing for our nation and for our citizens. Fusion centers are at the epicenter of addressing many of the vulnerabilities revealed in the aftermath of the 9/11 tragedy, but they are also places where the most sensitive information is exchanged. Some of our most insightful national security information is exchanged in these centers, and accordingly, we must ensure that with the exchange of this information, the privacy, rights, and civil liberties of our citizens are always protected. This challenge epitomizes the struggle that we have as a nation to protect our citizens while at the same time ensuring the protection of their civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy. The 9/11 Commission Act, recently passed by this Congress, goes a long way in assisting us in the proper management and relationship with fusion centers from the federal level. The informed provisions of the Act will help us make our program better and the nation safer while guaranteeing the protection of our citizens' personal information and privacy. We applaud the Congress on the development and implementation of this Act. Last year, my boss, Mr. Allen, briefed you that we intended to have 20 DHS intelligence officers deployed to fusion centers around the nation by the end of 2007. I am pleased to inform you that we will meet this goal. As of today, we have deployed 19 officers from the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, who are on station working daily with our state and local partners in fusion centers. Additionally, we have 36 other officers from across the DHS enterprise that are also working in fusion centers at various levels. Just last week, we selected an additional 5 officers from INA who we anticipate will be on station by the end of this calendar year, and we are working on hiring 2 additional officers for deployment to New York City as we speak. Selecting these officers is not easy. In every case, we work with the fusion center to determine what the needs are specific to that center, and we try to select those officers who will best meet those needs. It is not a precise science, but we feel it is the most effective way to ensure the value proposition for our relationship with the fusion center is recognized. We hope to have 35 officers deployed by the end of next year, and the goal of the program is to provide every primary fusion center within a state a representative over the following 3 years. The response we have received thus far from the fusion centers is unanimously favorable, and in many cases, the fusion centers have made public acknowledgments that this is some of the best support that they have received from the federal level. I receive nearly weekly commendations from the states for the work of our deployed officers. They alone, however, do not provide the support that the states require. Behind each of these officers, when we deploy them, there are many skilled workers who are preparing products for dissemination, analyzing the risk of that state and the risk that that state and their local partners face, and working as part of the intelligence cycle to ensure that our customers receive the most timely, relevant, and actionable intelligence we have to assist them in mitigating these threats as they become known. Detailed in my formal testimony are statistics too numerous to mention in this short period of time that demonstrate a renewed level of commitment to the states. We have worked mightily to ensure that we are meeting their needs, and we do not work alone. Our federal partners in the DOJ, the FBI, and the intelligence community are working with us.
Could you please summarize at this point, Mr. Tamarchio?
Absolutely. Madam Chairwoman, as I said before, we are pleased with the progress we have made. We haven't licked all the problems yet. There are many challenges that are ahead. We believe, however, that the DHS, together with our federal partners, together with our state and local partners, can meet these challenges and make the progress that this committee will scrutinize us on, and we think make the progress that will not only protect our homeland, but also ensure the protection of the civil rights and civil liberties of our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mines, please summarize your testimony in 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Harmon and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to be here with my colleagues to discuss with you our collaborative efforts in the support of fusion centers. The FBI, along with DHS and DOJ, established partnerships with fusion centers to provide, among other things, manpower and operational advice with the goal of fashioning a nationwide network of fusion centers that would be the cornerstone for information sharing with state, tribal, and local agencies in order to maximize the nation's ability to detect, prevent, investigate, and respond to terrorist and criminal activity. In furtherance of this goal, FBI Director Robert Mueller instructed each field division to participate in fusion centers across the country. As a result, the FBI has assigned over 200 agents and analysts in 36 fusion centers and plans to increase the level of personnel commitment in the near future. Throughout its history, the FBI has relied on strong relationships with its partners in order to carry out its mission. These relationships have proved critical since the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Our participation in fusion centers continues this tradition of partnership. We have made great strides with the Fusion Center initiative over the past year, but we realize that there's more work to be done. With our partners, we will continue to streamline the security clearance process, improve the facilitation of access to federal data systems, formulate and deliver training, and provide additional guidance. The FBI is working to resolve these issues with DHS, DOJ, and our state, local, and tribal partners. My full statement is submitted for the record. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being so efficient. Chair now recognizes Mr. Beasley for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chairwoman, Representative Harmon, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee. Again, I'm Norm Beasley with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, and it is an honor to be here today representing both the Sheriff's Office, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the state of Arizona, and the men and women of the Arizona Counterterrorist Information Center. And at this point, I would be remiss in not publicly commenting on the support that we have received from both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. We could not have done and been as successful as we have been in Arizona without their support. The critical link in the overall intelligence process are the agencies that are closest to their communities. That's us, state and local. The challenge really faced by the national intelligence community is how to establish real-time linkages between those jurisdictions in order that they can provide real-time intelligence to them, and I think equally important, receive real-time intelligence from those state and local agencies. And I wish to comment on several issues that were raised by the CRS report. The first one is a national fusion center strategy. State and local fusion centers were developed to meet local operational needs. There are no two fusion centers alike, nor should they be. However, there can and should be some consistency both in information sharing protocols and in baseline capabilities. To this end, the federal government should develop and articulate a national fusion center strategy that clearly defines the role of that state and local fusion center and within the national intelligence community architecture. Technical assistance. This is a critical component of both the DOJ and DHS program that supports state and local fusion centers and is already addressing a number of the issues raised by the CRS report. This program provides on-site assistance to state and local fusion centers in developing their programs. Supported by both the FBI and DHS, the TA program can and does ensure consistency between state and local fusion centers in areas where there is common ground by providing early assistance in the development and implementation process. It also has proved to be a vehicle for creating a strong partnership among a jurisdiction's multidisciplinary stakeholders. Training. Training that is specific to state and local fusion centers is an essential element of the overall national program. While many state and local fusion centers have a well-established training program that covers privacy, security, intelligence operations, what is really needed is an expanded capability that is specific to those fusion centers. Examples would be analytical, intelligence fusion center leadership, sustaining that intelligence function, a terrorism liaison officer program, community outreach, and how do these fusion centers interact with the national intelligence community. Funding, probably one of the primary concerns of the fusion center community. How do we receive funds to start up a fusion center? How do we receive money to sustain it? Realizing that the federal grant monies are not a lifetime grant, and there has to be a partnership between not only the federal government but the state and local jurisdictions, that at some point in time those fusion centers will become the responsibility of that state and local jurisdiction. Ideally, under the grant process, there needs to be a specific funding stream for fusion centers under prevention, so there is some very clear guidance to those state and local fusion centers as where their money is going to come from. Information sharing is the core issue facing us today. Homeland security efforts must be information-driven. Everything we do has got to be based on real-time, solid intelligence. Prevention is the primary concern, and our ability to collect, analyze, and most importantly, share information is paramount in this process. Currently, the federal government has taken a number of steps to enhance the information sharing process. While it is unrealistic to have one system that fits all, what we would like to see is one system that does provide that connectivity between the state and local fusion centers and the national intelligence community. And looking at the National Terrorist Screening Center, that may be the vehicle that accomplishes this. In closing, again, I want to thank you for the opportunity. I have included a case study done by DHS on the Arizona Counterterrorist Information Center that gives the community an overview of a mature center, and I'm ready to answer any questions.
Right on time. Thank you, Mr. Beasley. You can bet on our calling on you as we work on this issue of a national strategy. It is absolutely critical in our view that the state and local perspective get into all of this. After all, you're the customer, and the whole point is to give you added tools to know what's going on in your neighborhood so we can prevent and disrupt potential harm against Americans. Full stop. Let me make a couple of comments about the testimony and ask a few questions. Mr. Tamarchio, you gave us a lot of statistics, and more is in your written testimony about all the goals, and this date something was set up, and that date something else was set up, and all of these people are moving around. I think that is useful, but I think that is not the objective. That the objective is, as Mr. Beasley said, in real time to provide accurate, actionable intelligence to those in our communities who need it so that they can prevent harm. So I think we have to focus on the objective. These fusion centers are not there so that some certain number of DHS personnel can move there, some amount of money can move there, but so that some amount of accurate intelligence can move there. Is there any disagreement with what I just said?
None
No.
from me.
All right, so let me just ask this question to each of you. There are issues with providing connectivity to these centers. There are duplicative networks. I think you all know that. There's HISN, there's RISNet. Every time we've been to these places, they've shown us 4 or 5 different systems, told us about what their perspective is on each of these, the advantages, disadvantages, but they have complained about this. Similarly, there are problems with security clearances. There are problems between you, DHS and FBI, with respect to clearing people, and there are problems clearing people. So if our bottom line here is to get real-time intelligence to people who need it and have these fusion centers be part of that function, how does each of you, and I'd like you to comment, Mr. Beasley, after they answer, and to see whether you think their suggestions are the most useful suggestions. How is each of you planning to deal with this issue of connectivity and security clearances?
I'll go first. Madam Chairwoman, you're absolutely right. I've traveled to about 29 fusion centers, and I can remember when I went to the ACTIC, I was told that they can go to LEO, they can go to RISNet, they can go to HSIN. It was like,
Why don't you spell out these terms for the record, because some of the public watching won't know what you're talking about.
okay, the Homeland Security Information Network is in HSDN, Homeland Security Data Network. LEO is the law enforcement, what's the O stand for?
Online.
Online, thank you. And that the individuals who are working down in the Fusion Center sometimes feel that they have to forum shop to go around and check which system is up. We realize that, and I know that the FBI and the DHS are working to find a common portal of access between the RISNet and the LEO system and the HSIN system. That's still being worked on, and it's not completed yet. It's in the hands of the technical folks, but we do realize that. And I asked the question myself. I said, why can't this just be like AOL, and somebody goes there and finds the place they want to go as your single access point? So I think we do realize that, and we're working on that.
I concur with my colleague. It is a huge problem based on my visits to fusion centers across the country and some of the feedback I get. We're looking at various systems. I know that we have provided connectivity for our persons at the fusion centers through FBI Net to allow them functionality in that space. However, that doesn't satisfy the issues that are addressed by the fusion center personnel. Again, we're looking at HSDN to be that portal, I believe. But again, our technical persons from both DHS and FBI are looking at that.
And security clearances, very quickly. What efforts are you making to have the same requirements and to make this easier for people?
There are two issues with security clearances. One was the time it took to get the security clearances for the persons in fusion centers. And at the FBI, we recognized that issue, and we were able to cut in half the time it took to process the security clearances for persons in fusion centers. The second issue is a community-wide issue that we struggle with, not only with FBI and DHS, but also throughout the intelligence community. As a matter of point, the ODNI recognized that as an issue in his 100-day plan as something that he needs to address and solve. My security division is working with the ODNI to find a way to have a common process to pass security clearances, and that's the issue, passing from one agency to the other.
Thank you. Mr. Beasley, you get the last word here. I just would note for everyone that this subcommittee is working on the subject of overclassification. If we could come up with something much simpler, we believe we could find a way around this serious security clearance problem. Mr. Beasley.
I'll tackle the security clearance problem first, and we are probably the exception to the rule in Arizona, is that we have no problem with the security clearance issue. We partnered early on with the FBI. They have virtually cleared all 240 some state and local, not only law enforcement, but fire service to at least the secret level. And so that the security clearance issue is not a problem to us. As it relates to the data sharing, that is a problem, and it's especially a problem for our analysts that have to go into multiple systems. And we basically deal with two types of information. The first type would be DHS information that is more strategic in nature. But I think more importantly to us at the operational level is tactical intelligence information that is very case specific, and that talks about specific groups, specific individuals, and that's the type of information that we normally would get from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who is our very close investigative partner. So I think we're really talking about two types of information that is disseminated to state and local fusion centers.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dent, the new ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I'll start with my first question to Mr. Tamarcho and Mr. Mines. As you know, these fusion centers are staffed largely by law enforcement personnel. And should this staffing be expanded to include representatives from other disciplines? And if you agree with that, what other sorts of disciplines should be represented in the makeup of any given fusion center?
Mr. Dent, I believe that it should be expanded, and we've found in some states that other individuals from, for example, the fire service or Fish and Game or public health officials are sitting in fusion centers. In some cases, there are even some private sector representatives in a fusion center or have access to a fusion center. I think this is something that's going in the right direction because they provide skill sets and they provide knowledge bases that might not be readily available to a law enforcement officer or National Guard officer that's sitting in the fusion center. So I do support that.
Mr. Mines?
I concur with my colleague. I think earlier you heard about the migration of the fusion centers going from just terrorist activity to all crimes, all hazards. I think that is a good thing. I think that it opens up more streams of information and intelligence that we can exploit. Also, in recognizing the uptick in violent crime that we've read about lately, it's very important that these centers be in a position to support that. The public partnership is an important piece. Some fusion centers are ahead of the curve with that, and that's the direction in which we believe they should go.
Thank you. Also, in the CRS report, it was noted that that many of the state centers indicated that there were problems with database integration, and that it was with making sure that the personnel working in those centers had access to all the pertinent databases. I think that's an issue in my own state as well. And why is that so? Why is this? Are we having this integration problem?
I'll go.
Is it a technological problem? Or is it?
I think there's the problem is, again, there's a proliferation of databases, and obviously the customers out in the fusion centers don't want to see 9 places to go to get information. They're looking for a single point of contact. I think it is now a technical issue that we are addressing to try and shrink this profusion of databases down to 1 or 2 single points of contact or ports of entry. And as we testified earlier, that's being looked at by both FBI and DHS and worked on by our technical folks.
So it's not a matter then of state officials being denied access to appropriate data because of security clearance issues then?
I think that again, these databases operate at the secret level, and individuals who are accessing them have secret clearances.
So, okay, so then the issue is largely technological software. That seems to be the issue then.
Well, I'm not an IT guy, but I would think a lot of this is really trying to get our technical folks to get their arms around it and find a way to make this much more user-friendly.
Mr. Mines, you have any?
I think it's a two-pronged problem. I think it's technological, and I think it's also the time it takes to get security clearances done, and providing security clearances for as many persons in the fusion centers as we can. We also have to remember that a lot of these databases existed before the fusion centers did. So we have to ensure that as we brought all those pipes to the fusion centers, that they have access to the databases that are the most robust systems, and ensure that we can service them with 1, maybe 2 systems instead of the 16 that I've heard they complain about in the centers.
Mr. Beasley, you want to add anything on this from your perspective?
That's absolutely correct. Again, we don't have any problem with the security clearance issue, but just in our center alone, we have, not counting our federal classified systems, we have over 100 databases that we routinely access, and it is extremely labor intensive and time consuming, and I'm not a technical person either, but we've had our technical people in, and they basically throw their hands up. Ideally, there'd be a black box that you could put on your system and it would do all that. But to date, at least no one in our shop has been able to come up with that technology.
Fair enough. Just finally, Mr. Mines, I guess, might be the best person to ask this question to, but how do you feel it's the best way for us to address privacy concerns raised by the existence of these fusion centers?
I think the best way to handle it is how we are handling it, is through training. Training of the personnel in the fusion centers as to how to handle sensitive information, how to store sensitive information. I think through DHS we have a pretty robust training program, and I do know that the state and locals have their own training programs that speak to that issue.
I would concur with Mr. Mines that this is a training challenge, and it's one that I think both the FBI and the DHS are addressing robustly.
I thank you, Mr. Dent. Chair now yields 5 minutes to Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado for questions.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And Mr. Tamarchio, let me just start with you with the first question I asked the last panel. Are you in charge of fusion centers for DHS, or who is?
I think right now fusion centers are in charge of fusion centers. These are, as you know, state organizations funded by the states in most cases and stood up by the states. We don't operate in a position where we can dictate to them, nor should we, how they operate their fusion centers. So I would say right now that the way it works is the fusion centers are in charge of their operations.
Okay, but from DHS's point of view, in terms of providing information, intelligence, analysis, who's in charge of working with the fusion centers? Let me put it that way.
The executive agent for working with the fusion centers comes out of my office, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis.
Okay. And Mr. Mines, is there anybody within the FBI that's sort of, you know, your job is to work with these fusion centers and, you know, make sure that, you know, the FBI is working as cooperatively and fully as possible with the different fusion centers?
Yes, that responsibility sits with the Directorate of Intelligence under the Assistant Director Murphy.
Okay. I know in Colorado, and it sounds like the Arizona experience is better than Colorado, where we really have a, you know, just a small group that's developing, and it will get a lot bigger over the course of the next year with the convention coming. But one of the two complaints have been on the credentialing side as to security clearance, and then really not the quality, but the substance of the information that's shared from the top down. And I think the response is you don't get much good information going from the bottom up because they feel it's just a one-way street. Can you react to that, anybody?
Congressman, I know that that's an issue that concerns us greatly. We want to provide intelligence to the fusion centers that's actionable intelligence that's important to them, and sometimes I think there's a cultural bias in the intelligence community, which for many years wrote strategic products for the intelligence community or for the Beltway. We now have to work to make sure that the intelligence that we write is of interest and usable for the cop on the beat or the guy that's in charge of security in the harbor. And I think that that's a work in progress. We are doing that right now in many cases with regard to specific reports such as prison radicalization, WMDs. We recently had a conference at Camp Parks, California, with about 500 local analysts from different states to discuss the threat of WMDs and what they would need to know about in their particular areas. That's a work in progress, though.
Mr. Perlmutter, excuse me for interrupting, but we have 4 votes coming up, and I think what we need to do is limit questions by each member so that we can adjourn this hearing before the votes in order to give you a chance to have a day and to give us a chance to
I'll yield back.
Go on with the business of the House.
Chair.
I appreciate it. The chair now yields 3 minutes for questions to Mr. Carney of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This will be quick. Mr. Mines, the GAO says that there's sometimes trouble with the FBI accepting other clearances of other organizations despite federal law. Can you comment on that?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, that's an issue that not only the FBI and law enforcement, but the intelligence community is struggling with handling.
But why are they struggling with it? I mean, there's a law that says that this is how it's supposed to be. There shouldn't be a struggle, I don't think. Should there?
I agree. There is no baseline differences, but I think the law allows each agency to provide additional requirements in their security clearances. And I think that's the issue, according to my security division. But we're looking at that now, not only in the fusion center arena, but also in joint duty issues in the intelligence community. We're finding those issues too. So we're looking to streamline that and address that appropriately.
Are you talking about compartments here, or compartments within a certain clearance level, or are you, that's not what you're referring to then?
No.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I do intelligence too, and the inability to share information, of course, hamstrings us and really diminishes what we're able to do and how quickly we're able to do it. So please resolve that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carney. Chair now yields 3 minutes for questions to Mr. Dix of Washington.
Thank you. Mr. Beasley, do you believe that Arizona's Fusion Center is producing useful information, and what steps are you taking to continually improve those products?
The answer to, excuse me. Yes, we are. I can absolutely tell you that the information generated through the center is helping to solve crimes and to further counter-terrorist investigations, and we do that through our analytical component, through our community outreach component, and through our training component. In essence, we believe, no disrespect to DHS and to the FBI, but if we're going to stop a terrorist act in this country, it's going to be through a contact by a field officer, a citizen, a field detective. So we generate a lot of our training activities and awareness and what to look for to these really the true first line of defense. And this is why we feel we have been so successful.
Mr. Mines, and let me ask you this. Do you think we should have these fusion centers in each state, or should we be doing these regionally and using the New York City model as the approach that should be taken, with a lot more staff, a lot more federal involvement? I mean, you could still have fusion centers in every state, but what about having a regional group in the most the UASI cities in the country, to have something like New York has? Should that be the model that we look at to expand this grassroots effort?
That's certainly something that we should look at. Again, keep in mind the fusion centers were first stood up to address the issues of that state and local area. We have to ensure that their needs are met. But again, the New York division is a model, has a lot of good best practices that would facilitate the collection and analysis of information on a regional level, which would give us a better national picture.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dix. Chair now welcomes and yields 3 minutes to Mr. Langevin of Rhode Island, who co-led the CODEL we recently took to New York City to see the radiological threat in that city.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your leadership on these fusion centers and your leadership on intelligence information sharing issues in general. Let me just start. In reading the report, the CRS report was very critical of fusion centers, and yet we've got to get this right somehow. It's my hope that these fusion centers can be salvaged, that they can be made to work. I'm a big believer, as is I believe the chair, that the best intelligence, good intelligence, information sharing will always be the pointy tip of the spear, and was always going to be most effective at keeping us safe and being able to target our resources. And one of the members of the panel, I think it was you, Mr. Beasley, who said that in most of the time, in terms of identifying terrorist activity, it's going to come from the cop on the beat, and the detective in their work, and I couldn't agree more. And we need to make sure that the support, the guidance that Homeland Security, that FBI is providing, is making sure that you're telling the people on the front lines what to look for, and the people on the front lines are telling you and sharing what they're seeing. And I don't know that we have that effective two-way communication really going on right now, as well as the federal government being able to actually share actionable intelligence with our fusion centers. So, Mike, with the people on the front lines, let me just ask this. In terms of how are we making progress on common databases and making sure that we're not relying on multiple databases, but we have really one database, or moving that direction, so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing from the top on down?
Yeah, certainly, Congressman, I think that is a goal that we're striving for, to find that single point of entry, so that you don't have this form shopping problem that we spoke about earlier. It's a bedeviling problem, and it has to be fixed, I believe.
And what about the common training programs, so that we're training people in these fusion centers so that they can kind of change the culture, things that they may have been used to doing in terms of law enforcement, but we better train and more standardize the training of intelligence gathering and intelligence sharing. Can you comment on that?
Certainly, our department is engaged in a fairly muscular approach to training. We have mobile training teams going out with reports officer courses and intelligence writing and analysis courses, but we need to do more of that, and we need to bring those courses out to the fusion centers. It's very difficult for them to detail people back into the district for 3 weeks of a course. So we're doing that, and I think the FBI is also doing that, but we're both going to continue to do that and probably expand that training.
I know the chair and I have discussed that issue of wanting to standardize the training that everyone goes through in these fusion centers, and I think that that's something we need to pay more attention to. With that, I'll end my questions and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. As I mentioned, we have votes on the floor, although the clock looks a little strange. I'd like to thank our second panel for your testimony. I think the entire day was very useful, and this subcommittee will continue to focus on fusion centers and to improve the operations of fusion centers as a very important tool for finding out what harms may be plotted against us and preventing them from occurring. Thank you very much. Hearing is adjourned.